All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rose Melisani. I am the extension agent, one of them, out of Great Falls, Montana in Cascade County. And today we have our third webinar with Dr. Rachel Endecott. Rachel is a phenomenal resource. Her and her mom ranch in the beautiful Madison Valley, but we don't know where that's at, somewhere in Montana. And she also has her own consulting firm called Gray Horse Consulting. And I would recommend going onto her website and seeing all the services she provides. She does a phenomenal job there too. So today I asked Rachel to talk about purchasing bred heifers versus cows and also improving young cow retention, how to keep them in your herd. So please, we have a chat box here. So if a question comes up and you want it answered, then type it in the chat. We'll either visit it then or we can wait to the end as well. So Rachel, I give you the floor.
All right. Well, thank you, Rose, so much. I really appreciate the invitation to be on this webinar series. And I think all y'all are lucky to have Rose in Extension because she does an excellent job with her programming. And this is another great example of that. And so also welcome to those of you who might not be able to have been here live and in person who will watch this recording. We appreciate you as well. So with that, we'll get started. So today's topics, we'll talk about raising and purchasing replacements. And then we'll talk about whether or not, if we're going to purchase replacements, should we buy them bred or should we buy open? And then we'll come back down and talk about, okay, I'm going to buy some animals. Should they be bred heifers or bred cows? Then it seems lately I can't give a talk without bringing calving distribution into it. So this is another option for that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That might help you make some decisions as to how you might want to purchase animals. We'll talk briefly about some heifer development concepts, and again, we'll end up here with some young cow retention ideas as well. All right, so we'll jump into this whole idea of we want to have some, we want to know how are we going to make some replacements. Okay, so in this scenario, I'm kind of thinking, okay, just straight out, do I want to raise my own or do I want to purchase them? And then we'll talk some kind of heifers versus cows in this same scenario. So there's advantages to both raising your own or purchasing. And so some advantages that I see for raising your own replacement heifers would be that you have more genetic control. You have control because you have your cow herd and you have control over what bulls that you decide to use to create these replacement heifers. You are taking a risk, but if you find someone that you can trust to purchase heifers from that you feel does a good job, this might not be as big of a risk. Another huge thing for me is that the heifers that you raise on your own are acclimated to your management. So you've had the opportunity to be around them since birth. You've had the opportunity to cull anything that you don't like or that you see that you're not that you don't want to keep in your herd. And if depending on how you run them, if you're grazing, they've already been somewhere grazing at the side of their dam, and so they don't have to learn new pastures and those kinds of things. They're accustomed to the country that you run in. And then thirdly, you do have more control over disease, and you have certainly to trust who you're buying heifers from, or take some appropriate biosecurity protocols when you purchase heifers to make sure that you don't ever have any risk of disease spreading through your established cow herd. All right, so on the other hand then, what would be advantages of purchasing replacement heifers? Certainly you can expand your herd or change the direction your breeding program is going more quickly. So if you decide you want to switch breeds or you want to switch over to black baldies, you could certainly buy some baldy heifers if you had a straight Hereford or a straight Angus herd and switch there pretty quickly by purchasing, rather than it would take longer, of course, if you wanted to make those kinds of changes, or expand herd size rapidly by keeping your own replacement heifers. And certainly, depending on where you go and who you purchase from, you might be able to purchase genetically superior heifers to what you could raise on your own. That's going to be a toss-up and a case-by-case situation. And certainly, a huge one here is less labor and feed costs. So if you don't have to have a place or feed to feed the replacement heifers or place to keep them separate from the cow herd, certainly that's going to have cost savings. Whether or not those cost savings are going to add up in such a way that that's a better decision than raising your own replacement heifers is going to also be a case-by-case situation. So let's say you want to purchase some replacement heifers. Should you buy them bred or open? Again, there is no silver bullet answer here, but certainly if you're purchasing open heifers, so before breeding, whether they're as weaned calves or yearling heifers, you have more control again over the genetics. So you know what you have control over the bulls you're going to breed them to. If you're purchasing bred heifers, though, the other side of this is that you could have some reduced bull power, and you might not have to worry so much when you're going out to buy bulls. If you don't have to buy heifer bulls, you could pay more attention to other traits that might be more important to you than, say, calving ease or birth weight. I just said that. Looky there, less emphasis on calving EPDs. All right, so then comes the decision of, okay, I'm going to purchase breds. Do I want to purchase heifers or do I want to purchase cows? So I kind of think of this almost as an opposite of if I was in a drought and I had a selective culling situation where I was going to cull. Okay, so bred heifers, the young cows, could be products of the most genetic advancement of whomever you're buying these heifers from. And so it might be imperative in your herd's goals and situation that these young cows are imperative for you to make future genetic improvements. And so that might be a reason you would want to purchase bred heifers. However, there's going to be more labor at calving. They do have higher nutrient requirements because they are not done growing. And in general, young cows are less likely, first calf heifers are less likely to breed back than are mature cows, probably for those reasons stated earlier, in that they have higher nutrient requirements and there's a whole lot going on. I often say that being a 3-year-old cow, twos come in threes, is the hardest job there is on a ranch. On the other hand, with bred cows, you take away that labor piece at calving at least a little bit. They are done growing, so you don't have to worry about those differing kind of nutrient density requirements, and they're more likely to breed back. But as you go older in purchasing bred cows, they will have a shorter life in your cow herd, and so genetic improvement may also be slower as well. Okay, so I've presented you a whole bunch of different advantages and disadvantages. And so what's the right answer? Well, like any good question in animal science, the answer is it depends. And it's going to depend on your individual situation because there is no silver bullet and there is no one size fits all approach. But hopefully we've given you at least a few things to think about if this is a decision that you're trying to make here in the next year or couple of years. One way to do it is to take an economics approach. There are partial budgeting worksheets. Iowa State has a really nice set for raising replacements versus buying bred heifers. You can probably find others as well for the idea of cows versus heifers and those kinds of things as well. And then one way that you might also be able to provide some nuance of making the decision is to evaluate your current calving distribution. And we'll get into that in a minute. And now, when Rose first reached out to me, we talked a little bit about tax implications of purchasing bred heifers versus bred cows or purchasing cows in general. And there are tax implications, but I am definitely an animal scientist and I am not an accountant. And so you need to visit with your ranch accountant about how best to manage capital gains if you were to buy cows and sell cows and how long you might need to keep them and the like. And so certainly that's a caution that I want to provide here today, that is definitely not my wheelhouse and not something I'm going to provide advice upon today. All right, so evaluating calving distribution. This could shed some light on some management pressure points that you might currently be experiencing that might allow you to say, okay, in our current situation, we might not be very good at getting young cows rebred. So maybe we should buy bred cows, for example. So what am I talking about and how do you figure this out? Well, as the name implies, calving distribution follows how cows are calving within the calving season. And so you split it into 21-day periods, estrus cycle length of a cow. And so you can have your start date be a variety. There's a couple of different ways to do it. You can take your breeding date or bull turnout date plus 283 days. Some folks like to start when the third mature cow calves as their start date. So you kind of take away some of this early calf short gestation issue that you might have if you have some weather or barometric pressure pop somebody or something like that. So here's an example of what a calving distribution table can look like. This I took from the Breed Improvement Federation guidelines. And so in this particular example, we've got cows split out by age group, 2, 3, 4, and 5 and over. And so then you can see the differing numbers of cows in each of those age groups. So this is a 225 cow herd. And then if we look at the far right columns, we have days 1 through 21, 22 through 42, and 43 through 63. So this is a 60, 3-cycle breeding season, 60-day breeding and calving season. And so then within each of those cycles, you have the percent of that cow age group that calves. So in this example, 55% of the first calf heifers calved within the first cycle, the first 21 days of calving. And 36% of the 4-year-old cows calved in the second cycle between days 22 and 42, and so on. So if you're a visual learner, you might appreciate this data to be presented in a graph, which I have here. So this is the same data from the previous slide. I see I've got, so percent of calves born is right over the top of our axis. I apologize for that. And so then we've got percent of calves born in the first, second, or third 21 days period of the breeding or calving season in this case. And so we've got our going left to right within each cycle, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5 and up. And then in the black bar is the whole cow herd average. Okay. So if we're looking at this calving distribution with the idea that our goal is to have a good number of cows calving early in the calving season, there is hopefully one set of animals that might show up here that look a little bit different than the other age groups, and that would be the 3-year-olds. So you can see that in all other groups, the majority of cows calve in the first 21 days. In this example, only 29% of the 3-year-olds calved in the first cycle compared to 43 in the second. And so the 3-year-olds are maybe this management pressure point that I talked about earlier. So in this case, then I might want to evaluate, okay, what is it that we're doing or not doing that makes this happen? How could we change our management? And then another thing might be, if I was going to buy animals, I might go ahead and buy bred cows in this example, because it looks like we might have a challenge in getting first calf heifers rebred. So we'll talk a little bit more about some strategies to improve young cow retention near the end of the slide deck. But this is a way that you might be able to evaluate what's going on in your herd currently, help you make some decisions about how you might want to change some management of these young cows if you do have a problem like this that shows up, and perhaps help you decide if help you decide which type of bred animal you might want to purchase if that's a goal of yours. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about heifer development. And so just, oops, this is going to click through way different than I thought, but we'll do this anyway. Oop. All right, so here's kind of some general recommendations. Again, this is going to vary, but if you kind of boil it down to simple keep versus cull when you're selecting replacements from within your herd, keeping older heifers is probably a good idea. Younger heifers are going to have to play catch up a little bit because they're going to be younger when you turn bulls out. That's not always a problem, but certainly is, if we're going to be really simplistic about it, is something to consider. Heifers with depth of rib and volume. The goal for a replacement, a cow in your cow herd, is going to be to eat grass and convert that right into pounds of calf. Obviously, structural soundness is critical here. Perhaps moderate frame, so that we aren't going to have to get them to grow a whole bunch before they're ready to breed. And then, dam age can play a role here, depends on how aggressively you're worried about it. Again, if genetic turnover is really important to you, then perhaps looking at some of the younger cows for heifer sources. But there is something to be said for the idea of having cows with longevity in your herd and keeping heifers from them in hopes that they also will experience or exhibit that same longevity to stay in the herd for a long time. On the cull side then, really young heifers probably would go here. If their mama needed help at calving, we know that certainly those traits are heritable, and we might not want to keep that heifer. Bad dispositions, again, this goes back to if you have them the whole time and you can decide, you don't really like the disposition of heifer A, B, or C, you can go ahead and do something about that before you decide to keep her as a replacement. Whereas if you're buying replacements, sometimes you don't get those options. It's not quite as easy of a choice, perhaps. Obviously, Free Martins, we're probably going to assume the majority of those are going to be infertile. Certainly, there is a blood test, a DNA type blood test you can take. The dairy people are ahead of us in this category. There's labs in dairy country that will test Free Martins to see if they are indeed infertile. So if that's super important to you, if you get a split twins off of a really great mating that you're super excited about, and you can go ahead and take that chance and figure that out. Again, if they're unsound, it's probably best to send them down the road early. And then very large and very small. So kind of coming in the middle here, it's really easy. I know we have that same issue. Look at those big, beautiful, just framey, growthy, just amazing heifers in the fall. And it's really hard to say, well, these should probably go on the truck. But, from a matching cow type to environment standpoint, sometimes that's a good decision, is to go ahead and maybe sort some of those very large heifers out. All right, so some brief discussion here about heifer development. Age at puberty obviously is really important, right? So in order for them to calve as 2-year-olds, we want them to get bred between 14 and 16 months of age. And so there's several things that can impact age at puberty. Those would include breed, heterosis, and sire scrotal circumference. So certainly from a traditional standpoint, we used to think about kind of, more maternal and then more paternal breeds. So we would think often, smaller frames, overall smaller frame size, maybe British versus continental in this way as well. So animals that are have more growth and are later maturing, then obviously age at puberty is going to probably be a little later. I think since we first started learning about these impacts on age at puberty, as an industry, we've become really pretty dang good at decreasing that age at puberty. Certainly from a traditional research standpoint, crossbred heifers are going to cycle sooner than straight bred heifers. Again, I think we've made a lot of progress from the third bullet point here with sire scrotal circumference. So we know that larger scrotal circumference EPDs result in younger heifer age at puberty. Now, I think we've done a really good job here. Once that discovery was made, if you don't have anything to do someday and you want to look at sire scrotal circumference EPD just in any breed from, say, the early 90s to current, and just see how exponentially that has changed, you can definitely see that we took advantage of that discovery once it was made. I think a lot of times, we're having heifers cycle early, before they're weaned even sometimes. A lot of times those cycles aren't fertile, but certainly I think age at puberty is not as big of a challenge, I don't think, as it used to be, as long as you're properly bringing those heifers along and they aren't stunted in growth, for example. So when that idea of growth, then the target weight concept came about probably in the late 80s, early 90s. And we kind of consider that the sure thing approach. So if a heifer reaches 60 to 65% of her mature body weight by breeding, we feel pretty confident that that target weight is going to get us a good number of heifers who are pubertal when we turn bulls out or we AI, for example, and we should get an acceptable pregnancy rate from these bred heifers. The idea here is if we reach that target weight, 90% or more will exhibit estrus by the start of the breeding season. So the idea is we want these heifers to be cycling before we turn bulls out or we AI them, because this is old research now. I think it would be fun, and we've talked about it several times throughout the years at different places that I worked. It would be really cool to repeat this data. So the original seminal research paper was looking at how fertile heifers were if you bred them on the first time they cycled, or you waited until the third time they cycled. And so this is where this came about, that we figured if the heifers reach 60 to 65% of their mature body weight, they'll have they'll cycle more than once before breeding. And we knew that those subsequent fertile heats were more fertile than the first one from that research. So this has been bandied about a lot. And the question now becomes, well, do modern day heifers need to grow that big before breeding? And so there's been a lot of research. Nebraska's done a bunch. Fort Keogh in Miles City has done a bunch. And New Mexico State has also done a bunch that suggests somewhere in that 55 to 60 might be adequate instead of 60 to 65. Now, certainly this would take fewer resources, certainly. And in most of these approaches, they've seen similar pregnancy rates at a lower cost. And so why is that? Why do we think that we can get away with this whole idea of modern day heifers being a little bit lighter at breeding, and why are they still, exhibiting this high fertility? So one thing to remember when a lot of this research was first coming out about fertile heats and age at puberty and those kinds of things, much of the cow herd in the nation was having their first calf at 3 years old instead of 2 years old. And so over this time period, we've shifted that back to have younger first calf heifers. So certainly we've made some impacts on selection for fertility in that regard. Already mentioned, we've seen a great amount of selection and understanding of the impact of sire scrotal circumference on his daughter's age at puberty. And it could be, like I just said, that maybe heifers are more fertile, at their pubertal estrus. So the first time they cycle, maybe they're more fertile than they used to be when we were doing some of this research in the early 90s. So, certainly, again, no silver bullet approach here. And, there are things that, you need to think about, and what risks are you willing to accept if you're going to maybe take different approaches in your heifer development program. So for me, these are kind of strategies that I think about for improved heifer reproductive performance. So that heifer development thing is really important, that we do that properly. And then, pre and post calving nutrition of the first calf heifer or young cows in general, I think is sometimes overlooked. Sometimes it has to be just because you might not have the space to feed them separately. And I totally understand that. There are certainly limitations. But just saying, oh, she'll be fine, she has to be a grown-up now when she's a first calf heifer, is going to lead you to having to send a lot of open cows that you might not have had to. They are a different critter. I've had, when I was the extension beef cattle specialist, I had arguments with folks who were convinced that I was full of crap, which is fine. You can be convinced of that. But that heifers and cows weren't different. You could feed them the same and it would just turn out all right. I don't believe that. I don't think that's right. So certainly one approach has been to start the yearling breeding season earlier than you do the mature cow herd. We see that people are calving their heifers, you know, a bit ahead of their cows. And so this allows for more time between when they calve and when we want them to cycle back to get bred with their second calf. Hopefully, maybe you're a little more fresh at the beginning of calving season, so you've got a little more oomph when it comes to time and labor needed. And one other approach that we can take to maybe put a little pressure on young cows and yearling heifers in particular for reproduction is to shorten the yearling breeding season. So this might be going from a 60-day to a 45 or a 45 to a 30, depending on what might work for you. So this would require, so obviously if we shorten the amount of time they're exposed to bulls, we're probably going to have lower pregnancy rates overall. That's not a surprise. So in this case, to anticipate that, you might then have to keep more replacement heifers in order to compensate for the loss that you'll take from open heifers. So I know some folks who've been kind of in that between 30 and 45-day breeding season on heifers, have kept a few more and have gotten 85% bred kind of on a pretty consistent basis. And so that also, you know, so you're putting some pressure on those heifers to get bred. And if we're thinking about, okay, I've raised these replacement heifers, I hate selling open cows. But if we think about it in a cull cow market, what age group is going to be worth the most? You know, from a per pound basis, definitely is these open yearling heifers. You're going to just score high in the market. They're going to be in great shape. You're going to, you know, ding the bell every time. And so that's something that can help you kind of compensate for it. If we're going to put some pressure on these heifers, they're worth the most open at that age. And so that might be a strategy to consider if that fits into your management plan. So then if we summarize my ideas here from heifer development, I suppose if there's one take-home message for my entire time today, it's probably going to be there is no one-size-fits-all answer. There is no silver bullet, which I'm sure you're all disappointed because I'm sure that's what you came here for. But each operation is different, right? And so you're going to have to choose a heifer development program that fits your resources, your environment, and your goals. We're really good in the beef cattle industry about worrying about what the neighbor down the road is doing. We're talking about it at the coffee shop. And I think spending more time thinking about what works for you in your particular situation and not worrying or feeling like you have to do the same things that your neighbor is doing goes a long way into making you a more successful ranch and you not having so much heartburn or sleepless nights about it. All right, so then we'll talk a little bit about young cow retention. Okay, so I'm going to show you some data, and it's old data, okay? It's like my age or older, okay? That's old data. It's not that there's not new data, but the reason I'm showing you this old data is because we've known this stuff for a long time, and sometimes we still forget about it, or we still don't manage for it. So heifers are going to be different than mature cows in breed up, in postpartum reproductive performance. Okay, this is some Fort Keogh data from Miles City from the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And we're looking at first calf heifers versus mature cows. We're looking at postpartum interval in days, okay, percent cycling at breeding, and the October pregnancy rate. Okay, these are spring calving cows. So if we look postpartum interval, so that's how many days. My A's and B's are really out of whack too. Oops. So how many days is it from when she calves to when she comes back in to cycling, right? When we first estrus, postpartum. So in this particular set of animals, the heifers were at 89 days and the cows started back about 60. Okay. Do I think these numbers are lower in today's modern cattle? Yes. Do I think that the magnitude of difference between heifers and cows has changed a lot. Maybe not. Maybe not. There's a lot going on, right? That first calf heifer, she's still growing. She's uterine involution and lactation are happening for the very first time. They're also pretty dramatic if you have any experience with them. And so, you know, that all of those things combine to the idea that it's going to take them longer after calving to cycle than it is a cow who's done growing and who's done this before. Percent cycling at breeding, we saw similar things. So, and also do keep in mind when we go back to postpartum interval for a minute, in order for a cow to maintain a yearly calving interval, so in order for her to calve on the same day next year that she calves this year, she needs to breed back by 80 days postpartum. Okay, so if these heifers are waiting until 90 days postpartum to cycle again, they're going to have calves later, their second calf than their first calf. Okay, not ideal. And so because of that longer postpartum interval, we had only 32% of these heifers being cycling at breeding, about 90% of the cows were. And then that did translate then to a lower percentage of heifers, first calf heifers being bred in October than cows. Do I think that percent cycling at breeding and pregnancy rates are probably different now than they were in the late 70s and early 80s? Yes. A lot of that's for the same reasons we talked about with moving cows from calving from 3 to 2. This is probably in that transition period where we have first calf heifers who traditionally we had been calving them. We've been growing them out until they were 2 to breed them the first time instead of 1. Okay, so we've got some changes happening here. But heifers and cows are different. They have different nutrient requirements. Heifers are still growing, so they need more nutrients per pound of feed. They're smaller, they can't eat as much. We need to manage them differently because they are different critters. Okay, this is even older than me, old data. Okay, so this is looking at pre and postpartum diet energy level and reproductive performance. And my spacing is off again because I converted this from PowerPoint to Google Slides. So apologies, but hopefully we can get through it. So again, we're looking at cycling at 80 days. That's that to maintain a yearly calving interval. That's why we picked that number. And then we have pregnancy rate. Okay, and then we have 4 sets of numbers, and those are different dietary treatments. So HH, high, means the cows were fed, you know, both before and after calving at or a little better than their requirements. Okay, so high. So the first letter is the diet they received before calving, and then the second letter is the diet they received after calving. So we have all 4 combinations where we have high on one end, and we have low on the far right. So low cows were fed below requirements both before and after calving. Then we have the 2 opposites where we fed high amounts. We fed animals to requirements before calving and shorted them after. And then we have where we fed short before calving, but we fed high after. Okay. And so if we look here, cycling at 80 days, cool. It looks like obviously the low is only 22% were cycling at 80 days. All right, that's not ideal. Probably don't want to do that. But it looks like if we could maybe short them either before or after calving, and we still have about, between 85 and 90% cycling. All right. But then when we go to look at pregnancy rate, there's only 2 groups that have acceptable pregnancy rates for me in this experiment, and they were the high and the low groups. Okay, so if we feed them more than they need or at or more than they need before calving, and then we short them after calving, they're not going to breed up as well. Okay, now we could also think about what might maybe be the economics and cost savings and potentially labor savings of the low-high diet. Okay, but remember, if you wait until after calving to want to improve cow condition or feed better than requirements, that's the most expensive time you're going to do it because their nutrient requirements are the very highest in early lactation. Okay, so you can do it that way, but it's probably not the most economical or efficient use of your resources to do so. So not only do we have differences between heifers and cows, we can also impact the reproductive performance of animals by how we feed them before and after calving. Here's some more Fort Keogh data. We're looking at the percent of cows cycling at breeding. So this is all mature cows, and this is again looking at low versus high, or this is heifers and cows, looking at low energy versus high energy. So we're kind of combining the previous two slides in a way in an experiment here. In that, so if cows were fed high energy, they bred back, 85% were cycling at breeding, at bull turnout. Only 56% of heifers who were fed 58% of heifers were fed a high energy diet. Okay, so here we see the difference between heifers and cows on the right-hand side of the graph. And then low energy, even mature cows who are done growing, if we short them, they're not going to cycle. Okay, we're going to negatively impact reproductive performance. And if we have a first calf heifer and we short her, we're really going to negatively impact her reproductive performance. Again, do I think that these numbers would look somewhat different given it's 2024 and how the strides that we have made in selection in the beef cattle herd in the United States of America? Yes, I do think they would change, but I don't think the magnitude is going to change as much ever, because heifers and cows are different critters. So like I've alluded to, this early lactation time period is really important because we have milk production ramping up, uterine involution, healing, and repair. Okay, we know, even to the best of our ability, it might be that we have, to spend more time on calving difficulty issues in first calf heifers than we might in older cows. And so we know, again, from data at Fort Keogh, that calving difficulty negatively impacts reproductive performance. Okay, we're also expecting all of that to happen: uterine involution, healing, and repair. Boom, we want those ovaries to be firing. Let's go and let's have some ovulation happening, and let's get some estrus cycles started again. So all of that is happening no matter what age the group of cows is. But then you add that on top, you've got young cows still growing, which again adds a whole nother layer of impact that you need to consider. All right, so I maybe have convinced you that young cows can be a bit of a challenge. So what are some of my strategies then for this idea of young cow retention and improving young cow reproductive performance? I am a huge proponent, if you couldn't tell already, of keeping younger cows separate from older cows whenever you can. If you can do it, both before and after calving, do it, 100%. You might consider it after breeding as well. And perhaps if you have it set up well enough, you can run the first calf heifers pairs with bulls by themselves all year. I don't know. A lot of times that's not the case. Something that we've done here at our place, probably for coming on 20 years or more now, is so we have a 45-day breeding season for everybody, heifers and cows. And so when we're March calvers, so we'll pull bulls in early July, early to mid-July, I guess. And then probably, as shortly thereafter, depending on the haying, of course, so probably early August, we'll sort our first calf heifer pairs off and put them on fresh pasture by themselves. Now, that's not going to make a difference on whether or not they bred up this year, right? Because it's after we've pulled bulls. But it has made a huge difference in their condition going into winter and what kind of shape they're in calving as 3-year-old cows. And that has really greatly improved our 3-year-old preg rate more than I would have ever dreamed of. And why is that, do I think? Well, I think we know that those old boss cows, there's the dynamic, right, where you've got the dominant cows who are going to be, you can see it on a feed yard or in a feed bunk. Dominant cows are going to get the very best of everything. Well, let's not be fooled into thinking that that doesn't happen in a pasture situation as well. Those old cows are going to be able to get the very best of that pasture. And so if we take away that pressure, that can really impact young cow condition, and has certainly done so for us. We also know early weaning can make a difference in young cow reproductive performance. Is this something that I think you should implement every year? Probably not, unless you're uniquely well set up to handle early weaned calves, or you have someone who wants to take them. Now, again, like I said, if you early wean after you pull bulls or after the breeding season, you're not going to make a difference in the cow's reproductive performance this year. She's either bred or she isn't. But you will make an impact if you take away that milk demand, the nutrient requirement for her to make milk. She will then go in a winter again in better condition, etc. If you want to make a difference in pregnancy rates this year, that same year, you're going to need to wean those calves before breeding. So that's like 80-day-old calves. And so that's considerably more of a challenge than you might wish to have to manage those calves. But you will improve pregnancy rates without a doubt. But again, those are things that you have to think about, are those risks ones you're willing to take? So then, today we've talked about raising versus purchasing replacements, whether we should buy bred heifers or open heifers if we're going to buy them. If we're going to buy breds, should they be heifers or cows? We've looked at how calving distribution might impact some of your decision making in that regard, as well as just give you, some data points to look at to decide if you need to change some management that you have currently. And we've glossed over heifer development and young cow retention, and we could probably talk about those last 2 bullet points for 3 webinars apiece. But with that, then I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you might have. And for those of you who are watching the recording, please don't hesitate if you have questions as you've watched this that you would like to have answered. Just reach out, shoot me a text, or shoot me an email. My contact info is on this slide.
Thank you, Rachel. That was phenomenal. Just to comment, we ran bred heifers for 30 years, and we did natural service with bulls, and in June we would ultrasound our heifers and then put them into calving groups. And it was amazing to see how many of those heifers took the second, third cycle as opposed to their first cycle. It was quite the difference. And then we were always trying to get our heifers that we sold to our customers to be bred way before the main herd, our customers' main herd started. So one year we'd start them in July, and then July would be really bad, and then it would be February, and then the February weather would be bad. So we're chasing the weather a year advance.
A year
it
later.
didn't matter when we did it because it always snowed when they calved. So anyway, I'm just looking at the chat here. If there's anybody who has a question for Rachel, feel free to put your question in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask some questions in there as well. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time. I know a lot of you are on here and who are not shy, so.
Rachel, I have a question for you.
Oh, go ahead,
Yes.
Colleen.
Yes, Miss Colleen.
So, and I know you did some work in New Mexico, and they've been doing some work about keeping replacements that came out of a drought. So their moms were in a drought, they were born in a drought. Are you guys seeing any research about those conception rates and that kind of thing, or I guess anything that you can shed a light on?
Sure. Yep. Great question. So, certainly, I think probably, some of that New Mexico data as well as some of the Fort Keogh data. Now, the Fort Keogh groups were kind of a more extreme example where they had animals kind of in that high, low experiment that we talked about, somewhat similar to that. So whatever group this heifer might have gotten assigned to during her development, she was going to be in that same kind of group her whole life, whether, for any supplemental feed, if she was in one of the low groups, she was going to get less. So then once they'd kind of done that work for a while, they started looking at what happens if a heifer is she's born to those cows that were shorted a little bit, that were run a little rougher. And then what happened to her if she was also run rough, or if she was fed to requirements, for example. And so there's a lot of data in other species that says that like limiting calories can lead to a greater lifespan. A lot of those species are monogastrics. And so I think that there's some differences here that we're not going to be able to correlate completely to a ruminant animal. But there does look like if an animal came up in tough conditions, they might be slightly more resilient. However, you have to, that's a balancing act, right? Because if Mother Nature, as Rose just so eloquently pointed out, kind of wants to intervene even more than your short or your running rough situation, you might have a wreck. And so I think we still have a lot to learn about that kind of fetal programming aspect of what happens. But it's certainly a fruitful area for research. And I think, depending on if you've got good records, you could probably go back and look at some of those drought years and heifers that were born and kept from those years, and maybe see that retrospectively. That'd be interesting to look at.
I have a question. So if you are to go buy bred heifers or cows that are like within your herd, what are some questions that you feel are important to ask those who are developing those heifers?
You bet. So I'd ask questions about how they're, it kind of depends. Some of it depends, right, on, are these folks buying heifers and making bred heifers and that's all they do? That's different than I raise heifers to sell bred heifers. And so I would want to know something about, if the latter case was what I was looking at, I'd want to know a little bit about how that cow herd is managed. How were these heifers, regardless, I want to know how the heifers were developed. Were they developed in a feed yard? What kind of environment did they come in before they went into the feed yard? What bulls were they bred to? Obviously, we want to know when they're calving and those kinds of things. So I think trying to ask questions that help you understand how they'll fit into your cow herd are the questions that I think are important. I'd ask things like, what did they weigh when you started developing them? If they're, in that feedlot example, what rate of gain were you developing them? And those kinds of things. I just want to know a little bit about their background and whether or not, and where they came from, right? And was that environment similar or very different from your environment? Trying to find that, to make that be as similar as possible, is probably a pretty good idea.
Thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions out there? Feel free to either unmute yourself, ask the question, or put it in the chat, either or. Looks like you answered all the questions that
I
are
guess
even
so.
out there.
Who knew?
we'll give a little bit more time, but do you want to talk a little bit about your Gray Horse Consulting, what you do for people?
Sure, yeah. So I worked for MSU as the Extension Beef Cow Specialist for 11 years. I worked for the American Simmental Association for 3 years after that in the DNA department. And then I moved back to the ranch while working at ASA, and then hung out my shingle with consulting business, and I partner on the ranch with my mom and my uncle. And so Gray Horse is a lot of things. I do a little bit of everything, which is how I like it. It keeps me from being really bored, because every day is different. So there's a variety of things. I do quite a bit of actually communications work in the ag marketing sector. I also do some work for an estate planning law firm, and do some newsletter, social media work, and some other technical writing projects for them. There's a firm in Kansas that I work with, and they produce a podcast for a nutrition company called Balchem, and I write the show notes for all of those podcasts. So any and everything. I still do a little bit of cow consulting work here and there. I am trained as a nutritionist, but am sort of a Jill of all trades and master of none. So certainly happy to visit with folks if they have questions and those kinds of things. I guess the difference now between now and when I was an extension specialist is that I'll charge you for it now.
You gotta live. You
You
gotta
gotta
live.
live.
Well, and I think you're a Jill of many trades and very knowledgeable based. Terry
Thank
just
you.
typed in the text, very interesting and approach your real life experience in addition to sharing the research. So,
Thank
Rachel,
you.
we appreciate
that.
you so much.
Yes, my pleasure, you guys. It was really great to visit with all of you today. Hope you have
Yeah.
a great day and a great fall, and we'll see you down the road somewhere.
Sounds good. Just a reminder that our final webinar for this Night Check series is a week from today. We have Dr. Hannah Delcurto Wiffles. Her husband Sam did the first one on calf care. She's going to talk about the guts and the meat of calving, the stages, what to get collected for calving, you know, how to see the signs of when that cow first starts calving to all the way from when the placenta is expelled and all of that great stuff. So if you want to join that, you can go onto that link that I have in social media and all the emails that I send there. But Rachel, thank you a million for taking an hour out of your day. We appreciate it greatly. And it was good to see your face again. So
yes, good to see all of you as well. We'll take care.
you're awesome. Well,
All right.
everybody have a good Friday, and we'll see you down the road.